Hey guys, welcome to Behind the Scenes podcast. I'm Nunzio Signori, and my guest today is Associate Athletics Director of Sports Performance at Notre Dame, John Wagle. John earned his PhD in sports psychology at East Tennessee State University in May of 2019. He also holds a master's in exercise science from Western Illinois University, an MBA from Loyola University in Chicago, and a BA in physics from Augustana College in Illinois. Wagle also worked at DePaul University for 3 years, including his final 2 years as the Blue Demons Director of Sports Performance. In January of 2020, Wagle was promoted to Kansas City Royals Director of Performance Science and Player Development after serving the previous season as their minor league strength and conditioning coordinator. After spending the past 4 years in Major League Baseball, John took a job recently as the Associate Athletics Director of Sports Performance at Notre Dame, which he will start getting after next month. At Notre Dame, Wagle will be charged with maximizing the relationship within sports performance areas to impact Fighting Irish students and athletes on a daily basis by enhancing the collaborative efforts between strength and conditioning, nutrition, athletic training, and sports psychology. Please welcome to the show, John Wagle. Hey, John, welcome to the podcast. Did I get that right?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate all that. And thank you for having me on.
Awesome. I first was introduced to John through JJ Piccolo, or Piccolo, however he pronounces it, from the Royals in regards to some of our interns. And I was going to speak with John, but the COVID thing made it an online process. We didn't get a chance to hang out. So we're going to kind of chat today. I've been really looking forward to this one on a personal level because of what we do here at RPP in developing baseball players on holistic levels. So when I did some research on you, I was telling you before we got on air, a lot of stuff on eccentric training came up, and we're going to dive into that a little bit. But man, I was like, wow, this guy has all these weapons, and I don't want to just talk about eccentric training. So we're going to start with the managerial process. Okay. And some questions to kind of satisfy that bucket, and then we'll get into some other things. So in the past, how much were you involved in your athletes' summer training program? How is this different from pro ball in your prior experiences when you were in college?
Yeah. So at DePaul, obviously we didn't have a baseball program, but we had a similar cadence with the softball team who I worked with. And a lot of those girls would actually stay around and train during the summer. So that was a really great opportunity, but some of them would play on travel circuits or some of those other leagues that were available to them, similar to how collegiate baseball players go and play summer ball at the Cape or Northwoods, right, or those types of leagues. They would mostly train with a traditional off season. It was a relatively, aggressive general preparation phase, even though they were playing, just because the game demands are a little bit less. They don't play as many games per week, and they do rotate in and out a little bit more versus the college season. If they're an everyday player, they're an everyday player. And so there's more opportunities to train those athletes, even though they are still within a competitive season, even though it's not the true competitive season that they ready themselves for. Right. But really what you're trying to accomplish more than anything is to prepare them for the demands of fall practice, which are underappreciated in a lot of instances. So that was a big component of the summer training. And then obviously working with some other sports that are maybe outside of the baseball, softball realm. I spent a couple of years with men's basketball, and that's a really fun opportunity because those players are there during the summer to train. That is their kind of primary window before their season ramps up.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you, the girls or the guys or whoever who is not on campus with you, do you give them a program? Do you have correspondence with them during the summer when they're playing summer ball, or do they kind of like figure it out on their own?
No, you have to give them something to do, and you have to do so expecting that there's going to need to be individualized adjustments, not only for the physical development preparation needs of that specific player based on what information you're collecting in the athlete monitoring process, but they are handed a very diverse set of constraints in which they have to train. Even me personally, as a student athlete, now long ago and longer than I'd like to admit. But even when I was playing, I got the opportunity to play summer ball in Laramie, Wyoming, Nevada, Missouri, really great communities that just have different options for gyms, for workout equipment, for where you can train. And so a lot of times we would, have players, student athletes in similar situations that we'd have to make some of those adjustments, which is actually pretty similar to what you have to do as a minor league strength conditioning coach.
Right.
Those facilities are improving, but there's a lot of on the fly adjustments that you've got to make.
That's what I was going to ask you. So as far as the facilities go, how strict are you with your guys? Because I do know that in the summertime, there's people playing summer ball around here. And I have people come here for the summer. And their first question is, I have a strength and conditioning program already that I've gotten from my coach. If it's coming from a guy like you, that's great. I can be quite honest with you. I don't let him do it. I look at it and it's usually it looks like it looks bad. So do you, if you keep tabs on your athletes and you know that they're coming to a facility like in the private sector that has a much better reputation, are you a little more lenient? Because just from a business standpoint, I can't have athletes walking around with all different programs in here when I'm trying to create a system. So are you okay with a guy calling you and saying, hey man, listen, because I contact all the coaches. They generally just say, if they're training with you, cool.
Yeah, right. It certainly, I mean, your reputation speaks for itself, and there are a ton of really good practitioners out there that not only are we comfortable sending players to, and this is more when I was with Kansas City, not only are we comfortable sending them to, but we encourage it because they have really good training environments. They have really good training systems. They're aligned with what we would do with that player if they were there. And we can have an open line of dialogue to make sure that everything that's done is aligned with what we would want to do from a development process. All that being said, I had a mentor once upon a time tell me that I'll never write the perfect program, but I can coach my program perfectly. And that is really one of the most challenging things to do as a coach, which I don't do as much coaching anymore. But as a coach, one of the most challenging things to do is to coach someone else's program. And so really, I almost expected a line of communication to some of these private facilities so that we could just understand what the shared goals that we could have for that player. And then let them write that program towards those goals, because we're not there. It would be arrogant of us to think that we know what your environment is like day to day. And we trust that you do have that intimate understanding and you have the player's best interest in mind, and that you put those things together to come up with a good product that's driven towards the goals we have.
Yeah. And on the other side of the coin, I do get, if I get a program from somebody like you, a lot of times I'm going to be like, wow, you know what? That's really great. I'm taking that. You know what I mean? I steal. I have no problems with that.
Yeah.
And nobody copies anything that's crap. You know what I mean? So
because even when players would show up to spring training, if they were in, really good shape with some of the monitoring systems we had in place, our counter movement jump, our yo-yo, our 10-meter sprint, some of those other components, if they were in even a better spot than we had them in the previous season or the previous fall, like, we need to reach out to you guys and see what you did, because there's a lot to learn and people respond to training differently. And so if you had found something that worked for that player, that's where we need to come together and get those things together, because at the end of the day, the player is at the center of the equation.
It's the most important thing.
Yep.
That's the most important thing.
Put our egos aside and help the player.
Absolutely. You know what? I'm 60 years old, and I'm going to tell you right now that my favorite part of the day is when I figure something out and I can go home and go, man, you know what? I thought I knew that. I don't know that at all. That's a great day for me. Like, that's just like, that's a great day. So I got one more question from a managerial standpoint, because this is something that I'm always curious about. So when you were in pro ball and you had a lot of guys under you that were working, your strength coaches, how did you keep tabs on your guys to make sure aren't going rogue? Is there a system in place that you guys use that lets you know that these programs that you're passing down are being executed?
Yeah, of course. And, that starts we had a really, really good strength and conditioning coordinator in Jared Abel. He was able to communicate with those coaches, because at the end of the day, you can build all these systems to kind of keep an eye on training and how that's going, but you need a leader that can be accessible and approachable. And Jarrett was fantastic at that, to make sure that the strength and conditioning guys always had somebody to reach out to and to confide in and to bounce ideas off of. So first and foremost, he did a fantastic job leading that group alongside Phil Falco, who has a decade plus in the big leagues as a strength conditioning coach. So another just really good resources for our strength conditioning coaches to reach out to, and to make sure that we were all kind of using the same training system and style with the players. But beyond that, kind of on the more nuts and bolts side of it, number one, we did a ton in the way of staff education. So we tried to make sure, not that everybody was going to write a program exactly the way that I would, or Jarrett would, or Phil would, but we were all following the same training heuristics and general training systems.
Yes.
So for example, we in the weight room, we generally had a phase potentiation model. With our speed development, we had a short to long system in place. Conditioning, we stole from a few different playbooks, but stole a lot of Verkhoshansky's work, stole a lot of Mladen Jovanovich's work and his high intensity interval stuff. So we kind of made sure that whatever the underpinning big rocks that we had, that everyone had a shared understanding.
Everybody was on board. Yeah.
Yep. So that was number one, the staff education. And then number two, we did have record keeping, pretty robust record keeping.
That's good.
With, whether they were just training logs of this is what this player did on this specific date, keeping track of that, along with volume loads and sprint meterage, and all of those things were kept and allowed us to evaluate our training. Because at the end of the day, at the end of each year, need to evaluate the efficacy of what we're doing. Is what we're doing actually working? And you can't do that if you don't know what you did.
And if everyone's doing something different, you really don't have a basis to base anything on.
Exactly. And there's a ton of individualization in professional baseball. The margins are so small to make it to the major leagues that very quickly you kind of graduate from a group level training environment to a very individualized one. And so we needed to make sure that we kept diligent records. That way we could reflect and evaluate some of those things and pivot, because we by no means were always right. So we needed to be able to pivot and evaluate, make sure we didn't make the same mistakes that we were making again.
Yeah, because I'm looking down. I have about 7 employees that work here, and I'm always looking on the weight room floor. And every once in a while, guys kind of like they get a little bit used to what they're doing. And my whole thing is, if you have a new exercise that you think you like, if you have a new exercise that you think is going to be great, come up into my office. Let's talk about it. You tell me why you think it's good. If I can look at it and I think it's great and you have a great reason for doing it, and I think it's going to make the program better, I have no problem going in and changing that template.
Sure.
I've done it before. But when I come in and I see guys getting a little rogue and they're trying something new, and I'm like, why are you pulling him in anteriorly on a deadlift right now? And he's like, well, to get him to sit back more. And I'm like, well, that might cause some anterior shear on the spine, and I don't necessarily know that I want to do that. And sometimes the younger guys, they want to sow their oats. And I always sometimes I battle with that coming upstairs and getting on the same page before you do something. That's the thing that seems to always kind of go to the wayside a little bit.
And it's the nice part about being young is that you can experiment on yourself a little bit too. If you have some of those ideas, that was some of the most valuable experiences that I had I tell them,
do it on yourself. Don't do it on the athlete.
Exactly. Because the athlete, the player or the student athlete's career is such a precious thing that doing experiments on them is
we're pretty diligent. We're pretty diligent with that. Same thing. I have an onboarding process before you're hired here, and you spend a couple of weeks here learning everything, and I will assess somebody and they will assess somebody, and until it's about 85 to 90% the same, they do not assess people, or it's a whole thing.
Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah.
Moving on, at Notre Dame, what type of technology does the new environment have that you'll be using?
I'm still learning that. I obviously at the time of this recording, I still week or 10 days before I'm getting going. But they've got a really good collection of practitioners there on the S&C side, medical side, nutrition, everywhere, that they're using some really cool tools and ones that I'm familiar with, fortunately. And they have systems for velocity-based training. They have force plates on the strength conditioning side. They've got a DEXA. They've got a lot of really great tools to help student athletes prepare.
On the VBT side, what are they using? Are they using tendos or GymAwares, or they actually have accelerometers?
I believe they have Elite Form on a lot of the racks, and then I believe they have push bands as well that they're using, which is a really practical tool.
Yeah, I use VMAX Pro from SimpliFaster.
Sure.
I used push for a couple of years, and then I just went to the VMAX Pros. But yeah, the accelerometers are great. That my guys check them out and at the front, and everybody has bars.
We had GymAware with the Royals, and
I have a Tendo unit here for the real testing. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that creates a cluster at 2 racks. So these guys just stick them on, and it's great. So I was listening to a podcast that you did, and you mentioned a device that you use to measure muscle architecture, like pennation angle and cross-sectional area. Mm-hmm. What is that?
It was just an ultrasound device, a B-mode ultrasound wand, like you'd see, if you've had children, same general technology.
Yeah.
Just to see a little bit under the surface, and you can obviously orient that in certain ways to get kind of standardized images of different muscles. So a lot of people will do fascicle length measurements on the hamstrings, or pennation angle, like you mentioned, pennation angle, or muscle thickness measurements, or even whole muscle cross-sectional area with the B-mode ultrasound. And that was part of what I did for my dissertation.
Was there a particular brand? I'm asking for myself at this point.
Gosh, I'd have to look back.
All right, you can let me know about
what we used, but ETSU had one in their lab, which was a really great opportunity. And I went into my PhD just kind of trying to be a sponge and learn how to use as many of these tools as possible. And so that was one one YouTube video at a time. I was able to kind of get the hang of it, and it was really, really fun study to do, actually.
So you mentioned your doctorate. So you had the opportunity to work under Dr. Mike Stone, which is a guy who I have, over the years and years of just really admiring the stuff that he does. Give me one thing that just comes into your head every once in a while from working with him that just stuck with you. Just one aha moment that you kind of just continually. I know the guy had to say things to you on a daily basis that were like, what? So what is just one aha moment that sticks with you with that guy?
Having probably what sticks with me more than anything is Dr. Stone is probably the most adhered to what he believes in with his own training that you'll ever see. I mean, he still squats, he still cleans, he does all these, he still shrugs, he does exactly what he is instructing other people to do and what he's researching. So the thing that really sticks with me is actually maybe going down to Dr. Stone's office to speak with him on something, and he's in between sets. He's got his weightlifting belt on, and he's actually lifting, speaking to you, lifting, speaking to you, back and forth. And I swear, I think he could get out of his chair and still squat 200 kilos. So
that's passion.
He's just an incredible teacher, incredible educator, mentor. And it's just really nice to see that with all he's accomplished and all that he's kind of seen in strength conditioning, that he still gets out there and does what he's trying to share with others to do. That's really neat.
Somebody told me one time that someone who speaks with passion and really believes in what they're doing, which he obviously does, when you speak and you ask someone to do something in a training environment, and you're speaking with such passion. I remember somebody told me one time, I just listen to you, dude, because the way you say it, I just can't believe that it could be wrong because of the passion that you speak with. You know what I mean? And I picture that guy is that guy.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
yeah,
His lectures were, I mean, they're conference level presentations every time. He
yeah.
hosted
Wow.
a hour and 15-minute class on a Tuesday. So it's just such a unique opportunity to be able to learn under him for a couple of years there.
Right. So when you're in this, when you're working with VBT and you're working with video analysis and you're working with force plates and you're working with an assessment, how much is how do you take the numbers and charts? How do you distill this into palatable, understandable input to the athlete in order to get buy-in from them? Because I know, you know, I have to take, we have a 10 camera mocap system here, and we have hit tracks, and we have TrackMan, and we have Rhapsodo, and I take all these numbers and I develop a plan for these guys with the lowest hanging fruit. But when I get down there, at first I was trying to tell them everything that the data was telling me, and they're looking at me like I've got 5 heads, and they're gone. I can see already that did no good. So I had to figure out how to actually, for lack of a better word, dumb it down. How do you approach your athletes with data-based info? How do you transfer that to in gym?
Yeah. The amount of information that is collected on players now is astonishing. And you mentioned a lot of the tools that are on the technical side and on the physical side. So there's on one hand a lot of information to consume, but there's also, as you mentioned too, a lot of information that can be used to help players. What we had the responsibility and accountability of doing was really to identify what things were the most important in that player's development process. And so you very quickly try to kind of put that player in space relative to other players in their position group and other players that have made it to the highest level or whatever, normative comparison you want to make. But that's really the first step, is to say, hey, even if we just use something simple like a force plate metric, like RSI modified. Okay, you're a center fielder, you're RSI modified. And we usually communicated it in scouting grades. So we would use T scores, capital T, to put that on the same scale and the same language as our scouts have used. And so that allowed us to communicate not only to players, because they know what a 50 RSI mod means, and so do our scouts and so do our coaches. So it allowed us to communicate with a lot of different groups, which was great. But we'd tell that player, hey, you're a 40 RSI modified. And this
so can you please explain that to the listeners, 40 and 50, and what RSI modified is? We will talk about the reactive strength index in a bit, but as far as the report of 40 or 50 RSI modified, what does that refer to?
Yeah, so I'm no scout, so I hope that I don't do this a disservice or misspeak here, but really a 50 is average. Right. So if you're a 50 runner, you're an average runner. If you're a 55, 60, 70, on up to 80, it's a 20 to 80 scale. So on up to 80, you're a plus, so very, very fast. On the other end of it, 40, 30, 20 is you're not so good of a runner relative to your position group and relative to what you'd need at the major league level. So if you're a 50 hitter, you're expected to be an average hitter at the major league level. So what we did quantitatively was used it's called a T-score, which the way we approached it was a 50 is still average. It's the middle ground, but a 60 is 1 standard deviation better than the average. 70 would be 2 standard deviations, 80 would be 3 standard deviations. And then on the other end of it, 1 standard deviation worse would be a 40, 32 standard deviations, and a 20 would be 3 standard deviations worse. So we were able to actually put it on the same scale, just do so quantitatively. So when we collect a counter movement jump and we use the reactive strength index modified, which is how high you jump divided by how long it takes you to execute that jump.
That was going to be my next question. Do you have do you know offhand what your general RSI number was for a 50 for an average Major League Baseball player? Because I know what the average is for an average Division I college student, because I do it all the time.
Yeah. And we divided by position group. So we had corners, middles, catchers, pitchers. Those generally were our groups that we classified guys in. So each group had their had their own numbers.
Their set of numbers.
But obviously the middles were the highest,
right,
because they have to run, and RSI, even in the general research with external studies, that's pretty closely related to sprintability, things like that. So it makes sense that the middles would have pretty high RSI modifieds, and those guys would be 0.8, 0.9. We'd have players obviously that were above 1, which is really good. But for the most part, they were in that 0.8, 0.9 range. And then you could probably step that down even by like 0.1 increments.
So if you were taking their jump and you were dividing it by the contact time.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
You would come up with, because my number is different than yours. And I'm doing it the same way. I'm just wondering why. I did a study on Division I pitchers. And I did it in the frontal plane off the back leg.
Yeah.
See how quickly they can move like laterally with the back leg. My number was 5.1. That was most Division I college athletes, when we take their height in meters, that's probably why, and divide it by contact time.
Yeah.
5.1 became what the average Division I pitcher, and it even fluctuated between different levels of Division I.
Okay. Yeah.
Which was really interesting. 5.1 was the average. So your 0.8, you're taking your height in which measurement?
Just counter movement jump. So
right. I mean, but what's the measurement? Is it
centimeters? Yeah.
Centimeters. Okay.
Yep.
Right. So that's why.
Yep.
Because I'm taking meters.
Yep.
Right.
And really, at the end of the day,
it's whatever you test.
Yeah, and we rarely actually interacted with that data in its raw form, just because we also got accustomed to communicating about that variable or whatever variable we were interested in that T-score language.
Right.
So it was very
that's your number
across the board.
That's your number. For us, we know if you're below a 5.0, we probably need to work on landing mechanics, and this helps us in our initial baseline assessment. It helps us actually figure out what phase plyometrics we give a guy, because we're not going to just give a bunch of guys reactive Haydns when they don't know how to land yet and they look like shit, and then they're just learning how to move poorly. You know what I mean? So that's one. I was just curious. So you kind of do it pretty much the same way with just a different measurement. Yep. Great. That's awesome. Okay. Eccentric training.
Okay.
Let's talk about it. Can you just, I want to spend about 10 minutes on this. We could spend 3 hours on this, but I want to just briefly, you know, an awful lot about a lot of things, but you seem to really, you know, your thesis, I believe, was on eccentric training, right? And that is probably the one aspect of working with guys that I would like to know more about. So this is really, really great for me. This is a selfish taking on my part. So please, let's first talk about the concept behind using eccentric training and eccentric overload with baseball players.
Yeah. I mean, even in general terms, we all know that the weight we can lift is constrained by the concentric side of things. That's all pretty logical. But what's even more unique about eccentric muscle contraction is the force that we produce isn't constrained by the movement velocity. So you can produce a lot of force really, really fast.
Eccentrically.
Yes. And so that obviously becomes very intriguing, even mechanistically, for athletes of a lot of different sports, athletes that change direction, run fast, you know, essentially use the stretch shortening cycle, which there aren't many athletes that don't. So those athletes, that mechanism is really interesting from a training standpoint. And that kind of opened up the door to a lot of really cool ways to apply and look at the effects of eccentric training, which really just kind of made it more intriguing. Whether they were initial fascicle length increases or a more anabolic environment.
Hormonal release, yeah.
You have really unique hormone release and testosterone spikes and androgen receptor upregulation, all kinds of like really cool physiology that happens as a result of eccentric training. And so the snowball effect really got going from there, and it's continued to go even beyond my dissertation, there's been work at Sacred Heart in West Virginia, and some other schools have kind of taken the baton and run with it now to continue that space.
So here's my first question. With my young guys who are always looking to put on size, and a lot of these young guys, I'm not talking about 13 and 14-year-olds, but like 15 and 16-year-olds that are now have been cleared to work out on their own in my facility. A lot of these guys are hard gainers. They need to put on weight, but they need to put on good weight. They need to put on muscle weight. Is it safe to say that eccentric overload training is okay for kids that have a training age but are that young?
Yeah, I mean, it's like most training methods, you've got to coach it with attention. But I don't see anything inherently dangerous about overloaded eccentrics. Now you've got to, just like anything else too, you've got to progress, you've got to regress, you've got to load appropriately, you've got to manage the recovery adaptation process. Eccentric training is stressful. So they might take longer in between sessions, or they might be able to do less volume than some of your other training contents. But if you're acknowledging all of those other aspects of programming, I find it difficult that phasic loading, like eccentric loading in general, is an inherently dangerous way to do it. Weight training is dangerous if you don't acknowledge all those other programming considerations. So this is just one other aspect of programming to consider and to know, to the best of our knowledge at this point, based on our research and what athlete monitoring data provides us, of what it actually does. Because that's the other thing. Any knob that we turn or lever that we pull with programming, we need to have a decent understanding, at least qualitatively, of why we're doing it and what that's going to be doing from an adaptation standpoint to the player.
So I generally program this early in the off season as more of like a tissue prep phase, where we can work on movement by slowing it down, and with these isometric holds at the bottom, and making sure that we're actually coming back up. We don't really ever hit a concentric movement that's slow unless we're dealing with someone who wants to be a bodybuilder. But other than that, I look for a specific concentric movement, just that I can relate the VBT score, the velocity, to a particular load, and then just use it as a starting load. So I know where guys are. If I want to use 50% of a guy's, 60% of a guy's 1 rep max, and then I want them to do 4 eccentric holds down for 10. That's kind of like a tissue prep phase I would use, where it helps put on size as well. My other question is, how can we use eccentric training? 2 questions. How do you progress it? And B, how do you train eccentric overload in the gym without the use of weight releasers or like a flywheel?
Yeah. So first, how you progress it, it's considerations just like anything else. There's load, there's movement rate. And as I mentioned, the eccentric side of things is unique in that you can increase the rate of loading in a lot of different ways. And I'll kind of segue that into how you use accentuate eccentric loading in a gym without weight releasers. We actually did a lot of our plyometric progressions by holding dumbbells during the eccentric phase, and then the players would drop them as they transition to the concentric phase. So in theory, that's increasing the eccentric rate of force development and that downward negative velocity that they're having to encounter during that loading phase, which in theory then potentiates the concentric side
and creates that length. That length.
Exactly. And so pretty much every gym has dumbbells. And if you don't have dumbbells, we've had players hold chains. And that's actually, the chains are actually really nice because the dumbbells bounce around everywhere. The chains are great because they plop right down wherever you drop them.
So when you're using dumbbells, you're saying like a CMJ jump or a box jump, right?
Either one. Yeah.
So then you're kind of using this system once we're starting to try to develop power, or do you do this type of training early in the off season as well?
That would be more so where you'd lean on the aggressive loading side.
Right.
Rather than the high eccentric rate of force development
and
side.
What are you considering? Okay, so this is my question really. What are you considering aggressive loading that we can do without two guys on each side of the bar helping them back up with it? How can we get around that? Do we use 85% for two, or you know what I'm saying, right?
Right. Yeah, and it depends how creative you want to be, and it depends on the environment. But without coaches, if you don't have coaches
one coach
help do negatives,
but
you can, if you have one that can spot. We've done that before where that was enough to where we could help them on the way up. But even if you could set up 2 racks and have one where you're doing the heavy negative and then walk right over and
what would be too much time in between?
I mean, you'd want to make it as seamless as possible, and that's more combining a negative with a heavy concentric. That wouldn't necessarily be accentuated eccentric loading in the rigid definition that we provided for it. But it would be an eccentric overload training. And so I'd try to couple those just like any other potentiation complex, probably 30 seconds to a minute in between those, if you're going to set up 2 different racks and do that.
So in the second rack, so you wouldn't be loading like 85% to 50%. You wouldn't be doing that low of a load in the second rack, you're saying?
It depends on the time of the off season, but you'd still want to be pretty aggressive with the concentric side, especially if you play around with the displacement and you're maybe doing a half squat so that it's concentric only and there's not a normal eccentric phase on the back end of that complex.
Right.
So, you would still be able to load it pretty well and go from there, but you'd really need to adhere to whatever your concentrated load is and what you're trying to do.
So without the eccentric portion of the circuit, you're saying that you could probably use, without a spotter, we could do a 4-second eccentric hold with 80% and just do 2.
Yeah, easy.
Right.
Yep.
And that's still getting eccentric overload.
Yeah, I mean,
not really, right?
Not really. You're more getting time under tension there.
Yeah.
Which the tension is what people are after with eccentric training. It's even distilled down to what's the primary mechanism for muscle hypertrophy. Well, it's tension. And then we obviously have magnitude of tension. So how much? That's where the loading going up, it helps us out. But then we have the time under tension, which is going to have a less robust effect than the magnitude of tension, but it's still, there's a lot of metabolic mediated hypertrophy pathways and ways to make muscles grow. But if you can do heavier weight and time, that's probably where you're going to be able to get a little bit of the best of both worlds. But you might be limited in that case as the loading goes up. Obviously, that might limit you to only a single rep.
That's what I'm saying. That second rack. Yeah. Are you talking doubles, triples with?
Again, depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to improve max strength, then stay into.
But if you're trying to improve power and you're doing it in a PAP phase, that's going to be back down to what I was saying, like 50% or.
Yep. Okay. So whatever you're trying to accomplish, that's kind of where you're gonna be with it. But if you're trying to get the post-activation potentiation effect, the closer that you can get the eccentric and concentric phase, really with AEL, the rigid definition I was referring to, that's eccentric load more than the concentric load, tightly coupled eccentric and concentric action, and minimal interruption to the natural mechanics of the movement that you're doing. So obviously, if you have 2 racks going and you're back squatting, that's a pretty big interruption to the natural mechanics of your back squat, right? So if you can figure out, that's where weight releasers and things like that are great, because they allow you to kind of satisfy principles 2 and 3, where you have a really tightly coupled eccentric and concentric, and you get to do the movement basically the way that you were doing it without the eccentric overload on it. So having those tools is great. And the best probably thing that came out of my dissertation was a very practical one. And that's that you don't need to overload beyond the first rep. So your point about not having coaches and things like that, we actually saw our subjects hold on to high eccentric rates of force development for 2 reps after the weight releasers were off the bar. So they basically squatted as if the weight releasers were on, even though they had popped off. And so that was a pretty unique effect, that if you're trying to elicit some post-activation potentiation, you have a window there after the weight releasers have come off that you can do some really cool things from a training effect standpoint.
That's so different than I always thought post-activation. They always say, you know, you don't want to hit the second set before 1 minute because it needs time to potentiate, and you don't want to wait longer than 3 minutes because then it goes away. And you're saying even quicker.
If you're going to pair your eccentric and concentric phase together, if you're doing a potentiation complex, like if you're squatting and then walking over and doing a box jump or something like that, your potentiation at the end of the day is this really delicate balancing act between fatigue and the potentiating effect itself. Both of them are calcium induced. Right. And so if I have too much, I'm going to get tired. If I have just the right amount, then I get the potentiating effect. And so that's where, as coaches, we have to develop these easy heuristics to follow. And 1 minute or greater than 1 minute is a pretty reasonable one to adhere to, not only to make sure we're on the good side of that fatigue versus potentiation balancing act, but it also doesn't make our sessions, 3 hours long just because we've got 4 sets of a complex programmed in. And another really good dissertation out of ETSU, Tim Sukamel's original dissertation work was exploring that time window. So I'd encourage people to go out and search out Tim's work for that.
So when you're using, last on the eccentric training, in the off season, you utilize it as far as if you're using it with a heavy eccentric overload, and then we're banging out 2 to 3 sets of 40 to 50% of a 1 rep max for power. You're doing that later in the off season after we've developed some strength, right? Yeah. But if you're doing the 2 rack system that you were talking about, where you're doing doubles with 80-85% after, then that's earlier in the season when we're trying to actually develop some strength.
Yep.
Okay, great. That helped me a lot.
Great. I'm glad.
Hope it helped everybody that was listening. We didn't confuse you, but please talk a bit about the benefit of blending and sequencing full and partial range of motion and how you break this up over the off season. And would this be reversed for someone who doesn't have quite the amount of strength or training age as someone who was stronger and have a great training age?
Yeah. I'll try to break this into smaller pieces here, but the reasons to manipulate displacement or range of motion in general, you have a fatigue management element to it. You're assuming force output, like work is force times displacement, right? So assuming your force output's relatively the same, if I reduce the displacement, I'm doing less work. So if I can reduce the work, I, in theory, do some good things for myself from a fatigue recovery adaptation standpoint. But number 2, there's obviously, with a lot of sports, particularly ones that run, if you reduce the range of motion, it then becomes more specific to the joint angles that they're going to encounter within their sport. Even if we did talk about baseball and we looked at the back leg, knee, hip, and ankle angles that they encounter, you can mimic that within a sport, and you can do some things either frontal plane or even in the vertical direction and do it within traditional training environments and give them a more specific joint angle at which to train relative to the things they're going to do in the sport. So those are kind of the 2 primary things, but I liked your point actually about maybe more novice lifters going in reverse. I think you could broaden that a little bit, that some of the most important information that's collected that should inform exercise selection is generally in professional sport and collegiate sport done by athletic trainers. And if we have orthopedic assessments on those players, we know whether this player can squat, they can lunge, they can do those things. And it's not necessarily saying that they can never progress to full squatting or full lunges or whatever the exercise may be, but we'd be silly to make someone do a full range of motion squat that orthopedically they just can't do.
It's really to me, a squat is really a back strengthening exercise. It's only, you're limited to how much your spine can hold. So I'm a big proponent of single leg stuff because it seems to take a lot of the brunt off of the spine And to me, that's almost like a partial movement. Also, you get these guys that come in, some of these really elite minor league guys even that come in that have from other countries that have never even lifted, and also young kids like you were just saying. I'm thinking this year of, I've always regressed everything like a squat, learning how to squat. I've always regressed using a goblet squat first and front loaded a little bit so they can hinge and feel a counterbalance. And now I'm starting to think that it might be better to quarter squat or half squat, right? And you can load it a little bit more because it's a partial movement. And then as they get better at the movement, you can start to make the mechanical distance covered greater, and actually start by lowering the weight again and starting to get them down into a lower position. What do you think about that? Like, I'm thinking instead of trying to get my guys to full squat, like I'm talking about 13 and 14 and 15-year-old kids. For us, when they first get in here, they're only with coaches. And I'm trying to build a good movement base. And I was thinking that maybe half squats, instead of goblet squats, half squat goblet squats that can be loaded or held, so I can get them strong without them having to immediately, while they're going through the learning curve of learning how to squat.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about building reasonable progressions and meeting the player where they're at. And individualization really starts at the beginning there, even when you do have people that are newer to training environments. They come in with a wide array of capabilities, and some of them, that a progression like that might be the exact thing that they need. And some people will be able to full squat and full lunge,
right,
and
yeah,
do all those things
right
away. So
it's all on the discretion of the coach. But
yeah, and it's the value of having not necessarily a super extensive assessment process, but it is the value of having an assessment process.
100%.
That way you can have those decisions be informed. But if you don't, and you are going to generalize your progression to a group, then having something that's just reasonable and going to capture most of them is the best you can do.
Yeah,
and
I think that we use the groups as far as the movement goes, how we actually deal with each kid in that movement. When I say groups, I'm talking about a maximum of 3 kids to a coach. So it can be individualized a bit. I have a couple more questions for you. What is your protocol for monitoring CNS fatigue once harder throwing starts? Like, for example, I know when guys do pull downs here, I use a pogo jump, a 10 pogo jump to get an average baseline when they first come in. And then I take a percentage of that baseline, and I take a percentage of, if it's 10%, if they're not within 10% of that jump, we modify the set by 80%. And if they're 20%, they're skipping that day altogether, because it's just there's no intent there. So is there other ways that you do it that you may
we leaned pretty heavily on our counter movement jump assessment on our force platforms. We had players jump 2 to 3 times a week.
And so really what we were trying to do with that very broadly is to detect anomalies, either in their jump performance or in the way that they were executing their jumps. So if you change your movement strategy, that's a sign of neuromuscular fatigue. Or if you literally just don't have the punch that you did a week ago or 2 weeks ago, that's another sign of either really muscular or neuromuscular fatigue. And so the assessment obviously is we built it to be very sensitive. So we had kind of a set of rules that we looked at, how, kind of to your point of, if it's a 10% drop, we used, if they're, I think it was like a half standard deviation below, where they were at within the past month, like that's, so we have these rules that if they break enough of those rules, for lack of a better term, that would alert our staff and say, hey, this player might be fatigued, but then it's on us, the practitioners, to dig deeper into that, because any assessment is hopefully built to be highly sensitive, because you don't want to miss people. You'd rather have a pretty high false positive rate than a false negative rate. So we want it to be sensitive, but it's also inherently non-specific, which is logical even at face value. Like, baseball players don't jump. So it's non-specific. We're just trying to evaluate the neuromuscular status of that player. And then it's on us to figure out kind of any diagnostics that we need to do. And then that's obviously going to inform how we help that player. So sometimes it's sleep. Sometimes it is they played 8 days in a row and their running volumes are through the roof and they are tired. Sometimes it's their significant other broke up with them, or they're going through some other life stresses. So we just need to come together with medical, strength conditioning, sports science, psychology, nutrition, everybody that has a support arm around that player, and make sure that we're doing what we can when we do get a flag or we do get an alert to provide support. And sometimes that is skip a session. Sometimes that is nutritional intervention. Sometimes that is
hydration.
Hydration, whatever the case may be. And so that was an important piece, but we had that going year round. So that wasn't just when guys were throwing a lot. We actually had that system running.
You mentioned
at our affiliates.
You mentioned something really interesting that I'm going to check out, because you mentioned that you measure the neural fatigue and the central nervous system fatigue and muscular fatigue as well. I was using a pogo jump because of the lack of mechanical. It's a stiffness drill, so it takes all movement out of the equation as far as central nervous system fatigue goes. So that's why I was using a pogo jump, but maybe a CMJ is, I'm just trying to. I want to make sure that a guy's central nervous system is ready to roll, and if his legs can't get into a deep squat, I'm not as concerned with that if he's pulling down.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I was thinking
it's a good catch-all.
Yeah.
Low learning curve, has stretch shortening cycle involved, but isn't necessarily like the pure stiffness assessment like the pogo. It's
right.
It's just very reliable, safe way to evaluate a lot of different
That's
things.
good.
So we extracted quite a bit from that simple test.
Great. That's awesome. One last question. In our assessment, in the beginning, when a guy comes in, we do strength tests. We check his bench, we check his squat, and we check his deadlift, and we do it with bar speed and velocity. And it gives us we go up to we use 50, 60, and 75%. And then if he can make it to that 75% and he's pulling it at a 75% speed, that equates to his estimated what he should do in a 1 rep max, which we determine based off of whether we want 2.5 times trap bar, 175 of squat or whatever it is. We know he'll come up green if he's reached what we want him to do in a 1 rep max. And that's what we deem strong enough. Okay. Mm-hmm. And a lot of guys come in and they've got a 600-pound 1 rep max on their deadlift. And I'm like, you know what, dude? You throw a 5-ounce baseball, you really don't need to we don't need to come in here and deadlift heavy anymore. Maybe we'll just do it like, a couple times a month maintenance. But how do you determine and consider what are your numbers that you consider strong enough for a bench, a squat, and a deadlift, a trap bar? Do you remember?
Gosh, it's been a long time since I've done strength assessments in the gym, but my softball and basketball players back at DePaul were really strong. We had some 400-pound deadlifts from softball players, and we had some 600-pound deadlifts from basketball players.
Wow, with long legs and all.
Yeah, with their levers, it's super impressive. So it really, again, just like with anything you're collecting, it's comparing it to the normative data that you have. And so hopefully you've got an ongoing athlete monitoring process that you can learn as you go and say, all right, this is generally like where our point guards are. This is where our pitchers are. This is where our center fielders are. And then we kind of build towards that. But with strength training versus power training versus speed development and weighted balls and, all the different options that players have within their kind of player development tool set now, and what coaches are equipped to provide them to in terms of service, it a lot of times comes down to using those assessments to figure out how you want to allocate your time, because time is not infinite.
Right.
And so if a player deadlifts 800 pounds, I'm with you.
Time could be,
yeah, let's allocate our time elsewhere.
Let's work on moving faster.
Exactly. And,
right.
and I do come from the school of thought where stronger is better, and there's a lot of doors that open. Dr. Stone's classic saying is strength is a vehicle. And I do believe that, but I also, mostly through the experiences that I've had, have realized that time is very precious. And so we certainly need to maintain their strength and make sure that no pun intended, strength remains a strength. But, as you said, they throw a 5-ounce baseball, and they should allocate their time elsewhere.
Absolutely. My guys, I would say in the last 3 years of actually starting to go against the grain of like, hey man, you know what? You show up in September, or a pro guy shows up in October and he's strong as hell. There's not a big strength training phase for that guy. He's going to spend the majority of the time working on plyometrics and his actual power, instead of, spending time getting good at something he's already good at, so I agree with you 100%.
We flipped it around, like the traditional KPI, the key performance indicator, like what, if you do this well, you're going to be a great outfielder, infielder, whatever. As we got more refined with our approach to weight training, we actually tackled a lot more in terms of what we called like potential limiting factors. So what's getting in the way of your player development?
Lowest hanging
fruit. Getting in the way? Yeah. What's getting in the way of you, maximizing your abilities as a player? Because baseball is a super skill intensive sport, probably one of the most skill intensive sports on the planet.
Definitely.
And so it's not diminishing the importance of weight training or sprinting or anything like that for skill dominant sports. However, you do have to take a little bit of a different angle as you look at how that fits into a development process. And usually you're trying to find those things that are getting in the way. So sometimes a player is not strong enough. Sometimes they're not conditioned enough. Sometimes they're not powerful enough.
Mobile enough.
Yep, absolutely. So we certainly have opportunities to develop those. And to address them with traditional means of weight training and sprinting and things like that. But as we've kind of crossed off those things on our to-do list, the time should be allocated on the field, because that's where they need to. That's where
and also if you're spending 3 hours in the weight room, you're doing something wrong. Yeah. Something's not right. I don't know how, but this has been an amazing hour for me. I've actually learned a lot from you. I want to thank you for that. So
no, thank you for having me. This was excellent. Thank you.
People can reach you how?
I'm pretty accessible on mostly Twitter.
Okay.
So if you can reach out to me there, I generally respond to messages within a day or two. So I'm pretty good there. So that's probably the easiest way.
Great. We were speaking to John Wagle from Notre Dame. This was a great one for me. You can reach me on Twitter at Nunzio Signore. You can reach my facility at RPP_baseball. My website is www.rocklandpeakperformance.com. And if you're into velocity-based training, you could check out my book from Human Kinetics. You can get it on Amazon as well. Velocity-based training: how to apply science, technology, and data to maximize performance. John, thank you so much for being here. And hey guys, see you on the next round of Behind the Seams podcast.